This is the beginning of Part 2 of the course. Part 1 looked at ecosystems and used them as a model for thinking about how an economy works as a physical system. Then it added to that the mechanisms of social coordination that are unique to economies. This second part of the course is about the standard ways of measuring what's going on in the economy, as well as a more conventional way of thinking about it. Chapter 11 is about the gross domestic product, or GDP, and highlights from the national income and product accounts, of which the GDP is a part. Chapter 12 looks at inflation, while Chapter 13 covers unemployment. Chapter 14 is about the well-known tools of supply and demand, and then Chapter 15 extends that idea to the macroeconomic concept of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. For this chapter, we'll look at gross domestic product, first as the sum of value added, then as the sum of different kinds of expenditure. This will entail looking at consumption, investment, imports and exports, as well as government, which will be split into its own consumption and investment parts. Then we'll extend that with some other takes on how well the economy is doing, namely the gross national product and the net national product. And we'll wrap up with the potential GDP. We can start with the definition of the gross domestic product, taking it apart into its various expressions. GDP is the total value of final goods and services produced in the economy. Start with value. That means it's measured in dollars, or yen, or euros, so that we can add up cars and software and surgeries and everything else. It's stuff that's produced, not stuff lying around. That excludes things produced before the current period. It also excludes things produced by nature. The GDP measures goods and services, so it's tangible things like shirts, cars, gasoline, dental care, hamburgers, machine tools, warehouses, business software. But it's also actions, services like education, regulatory functions, courts, police, legal services. We're interested in value produced within our own economy. Our products we sell to others are in our GDP, things like corn, lumber, software, and movies. Others' products sold to us are in their GDP, such as cars from Japan, wine from France, or oil from Canada. Lastly, we're interested in final goods and services. That means you count the car, not the rubber in the tires, the glass in the windows, the steel in the frame, all of which are intermediate goods. You count the bread you buy in the store, not the flour in the bread, which again is an intermediate good. You count the sandwich you buy at the deli, not the bread in the sandwich, nor the salami. Again, those are intermediate goods. Since GDP is by definition about value, the model from Part 1 provides a convenient hook for adding this all up. Remember that profits and wages, the parts of your revenue you don't have to spend on buying inputs, are value added, or more specifically, exchange value added. And remember that all the expenditure heading up the supply chain toward the primary sector of the economy gets turned into value added. Some at the car dealer, some more at the car factory, more at the steel mill, and the rest at the mine. So if you add up all the different flows of value added, you're actually tallying up the value produced in the economy, the GDP. Each sector's relative importance has shifted over the years since World War II, with the primary and secondary sectors declining in the share of GDP that they produce, and services necessarily taking up the slack. The data available from the U.S. government's Bureau of Economic Analysis start in 1947. They probably run through 2012 at this point, but I didn't think to download them before the government shutdown started on October 1st, so I only have the data set I downloaded a few years ago, which runs through 2008. You can see services rising from the high 50% range to just under 80%, while the secondary sector and extraction both shrink. The turn up at the end in extraction coincides with rising oil prices. So that's the value-added approach to calculating GDP. You look at the value added in each industry, add it all up, and there's your GDP. We can get to the expenditure basis of GDP by following the money, because all that value added is somebody's income. As discussed in Chapter 7, income is the sum of the flows of exchange value added, and then it gets divided up into three pots. The government claims some in the form of taxes. Some is sent to financial markets when people save, and the rest is spent on consumption. Taxes go to fund government expenditure, savings go to fund private investment, and the rest goes to fund consumption. Since government expenditure is itself either a form of consumption, police, school, teachers, snow plowing, or investment, police cars, school buildings, snow plows, we have the beginnings of the expenditure basis for calculating GDP, which is that GDP is the sum of private consumption, private investment, and government expenditure. And if the economy were autarkic, having no trading relations with the rest of the world, we'd be done. The gross domestic product would simply be the sum of consumption, investment, and government expenditure. But we have to fit in imports and exports. First, step back to the physical model to see what's happening. Your economy might import raw materials, things extracted in some other country, then brought to your country for processing. An example would be crude oil or harvested trees. You might import already processed materials for further processing or manufacturing. Examples include gasoline, lumber, or steel. You might import manufactured goods for your service sector to sell, such as consumer items made in Asia and sold in the US. And you can import machinery made abroad and bought directly by a firm making an investment expenditure. On the export side, you could be extracting oil or harvesting trees and sending them abroad. You could be making steel and exporting that. Or you could be exporting TVs, cars, and even services like tourism or banking. Whatever it is, we're going to have to take it into account in figuring out GDP. Remember that GDP is the sum of value added in your economy. As the diagram shows, all expenditure turns into value added. But when you trade with another economy, some of your expenditure doesn't turn into value added at home, and some of the spending that drives your value added doesn't come from your own spending. In the model of financial flows, every act of importing represents a flow of expenditure out of your economy. The goods and services come in and the purchasing power goes out to drive the creation of value in someone else's economy. Exports are the opposite. Goods and services go out and the purchasing power comes in, driving value-adding activity in your economy. So we have to modify our initial expenditure-based expression for GDP by adding imports, flows of expenditure from abroad that will turn into value-adding activity here at home, and subtracting exports, flows of our expenditure that go abroad and thus don't drive any value-adding activity here. Note that what's being counted here as government expenditure is not the same as outlays. An outlay is every time the government cuts a check, whether it's a teacher's salary or your grandmother's Social Security payment. The teacher's salary is payment for work done, and the teacher is adding value by doing her job. The Social Security check is a transfer payment, money that someone is entitled to under law, often related to having paid into the program earlier, but not a reward for any work currently being done, any value that is currently being created. Both of those are outlays, but to make our expenditure definition of GDP line up with our value-added definition, we have to define government expenditure as expenditure on government consumption and government investment. We have to exclude transfer payments. It's not that the money sent to your grandmother won't show up in the expenditure. After all, the reason she needs it is for rent, food, or maybe treating her grandkids to an ice cream. So she'll turn around and spend most of it, or even all of it, just as the teacher will spend most or all of her paycheck. And so Grandma's spending, just like the teacher's, will be counted in consumption. But Grandma has the option of not spending her whole check. She could save some of it. And so it's not the government's action in sending Grandma the check that drives the creation of value. It's Grandma's decision to spend some portion of it that stimulates value-adding activity.